The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
We have talked a lot today about why we didn't see cyber attacks that we expected after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we've been looking at it from a very US perspective. So I want to take just a couple of minutes now and bring in a different, very important perspective. For that, I would like to welcome Robert Hannigan, who of course was the director of GCHQ and is one of our SIG principals, as well as Jeanette Manfra, who was already one of our SIG principals as well, and who was the former Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications at the Department of Homeland Security, and she now works as Director of Risk and Compliance at Google Cloud. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Suzanne. Great to see you. Hi, Jeanette.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, Jeanette, I am on standby. I will come back in with questions whenever the two of you are ready. And I do want to encourage people to go ahead and put questions into that chat box so that we can get to them. You don't have to wait until the end. Jeanette, Robert, over to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Suzanne and Matt and the team for pulling this together. And Robert, thanks so much for doing this. A lot of great experience working with the NCSC as partners both at Google and before in the government. So, so let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. So general consensus in the media is that the cyber war didn't take place. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's certainly a very strong line from the media here in UK and Europe generally that we over-exaggerated the threat. I don't agree with it. I think something interesting has happened. First of all, if you are in Ukraine, there's not only been a cyber war going on since 2014 at the latest, arguably 2008, but it's been really intense. In those months before the invasion on the ground started, there was just a relentless wave of attacks against Ukraine, against government and private sector institutions. And we've seen a lot of sophisticated new malware released into the environment in Ukraine, and it's still going on. So that says to me that their focus, Russian focus, is on this conflict zone, and everything else is secondary, which makes sense. And of course, Dmitry mentioned earlier some of the collateral damage from the attacks on satellite services or satellite provided services, which we've seen with knock-on effects in Germany, German wind farms and energy. So it's not as if nothing has happened outside Ukraine, but the Russians are focused there. I think it's probably only a matter of time before we see wider attacks against the West, and that will be a sign that either Russia is really losing the conflict or that it has spare capacity. So I don't think we've exaggerated it, and I think there is a very lively cyber conflict going on.
Very interesting. So talk a little bit more about what has surprised you the most. In addition to kind of what you had about the lack of spillover yet, but what surprised you most about the cyber conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question because some things, of course, have not surprised us. We've seen Russia using Ukraine as a kind of test bed. There's some great stuff from Google actually and from Microsoft just showing how much has gone on there. So we wouldn't be surprised to see Russian cyber aggression. And we wouldn't be surprised to see them embedded in the infrastructure, and we might come back to that. I think what's been surprising to me are two things really. One is the breakup of cyber crime groups along nationalist lines. So famously, the Conti group declaring for Russia, and the Ukrainians members saying, yeah, maybe not. Mm-hmm. We've seen that happen with a number of big ransomware groups and groups as far away as Brazil declaring for Russia. And I think that's interesting because, first of all, it shows how political they are in reality. And it means that Russia's cyber proxy army, if you like, which it's used to put pressure on the West in Western economies in the past, is in a bit of trouble and a bit of disarray. And that will take a while to reform, although we are seeing, I think, some new variants of ransomware coming through now, some very destructive ones. So I think ransomware hasn't gone away. But that criminal breakup is really interesting. And the second thing that's really surprised me, and first time I think we've ever seen it, is the Ukrainian digital ministry crowdsourcing. So saying to hackers, here's a list of targets in Russia, please go and get them and take part in the national effort that way. And we know Ukraine has a very active IT and cyber sector. We've never seen that before. And some of it appears to have been successful. It's hard to distinguish what is those hackers, what's anonymous, what's states, but there's clearly a very lively conflict going on through voluntary action. And that's quite unpredictable because we're used to governments doing stuff. This is a new territory. So that is genuinely surprising. And then the final thing that I think is surprising is just how important, shouldn't be surprising, I guess, but how important open source is in all of this. So everything from satellite imagery to social media. And I don't just mean information ops, so people manipulating social media, but just the sheer amount of data out there from satellite services, from the big tech companies and the platforms is phenomenal and is changing the nature of conflict, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm really, the crowdsourcing of the offensive cyber, I think that is really interesting and potentially a very significant change in the future of cyber conflict. Dig into that, if you don't mind, a little bit more. What do you think of, reactions of other countries to that? Because there's been a lot of talk over the years of, should we be leaning more into these capabilities and, our government's potentially too restricted in what they can do versus do we just want to make sure that we have restrictions on those capabilities? So I'd love your perspective after such a long career in GCHQ thinking about these things.
Well, on the offensive cyber capabilities, I think the United States has the world's most sophisticated capability and needs it, and it's good for all of us that the US has this. And countries will need some capability. I don't myself think it's ever going to substitute for good defense. Mm-hmm. Because we're open economies, and we need a very strong defense if we're going to do anything offensive at all. So you need both and a balance. On the social media side, and it's really interesting to watch. I think Russia has always done this. It's just done it in old-fashioned ways during the Cold War. It's discovered that you can do it cheaply and at huge scale and very fast by using digital tech and by using the big platforms. So in a way, that's not surprising. I guess in the West, we've been kind of caught by surprise. And I think big tech companies, Facebook, for example, have said, look, we weren't kind of watching this. And I think it's true of governments too. And I'm not so sure in the United States, but certainly in the UK, it's not obvious whose job in government it is to do this. And it's uncomfortable in a democracy. No agency wants to be looking at social media. Mm-hmm. So it's our instinct as Democrats is not to get involved in this. But I think you're right that we will have to do more of this in the future, and some of that will be through regulation, I guess, which is going to be some difficult conversations, I guess, particularly in the European Union. But some of it is just governments are going to have to start, as they did in the Cold War, watching what authoritarian states are doing and taking steps to counter it. And one of the best ways, I think, is to expose it. And there's a lot of that happening with the open sourcing of our own intelligence up to a point. I think it's been very effective in saying, we know what you're doing, we're crawling it out, and if this happens, we know it will be you. So that's effective.
Yeah, I agree. So kind of maybe back to bigger picture, what do you think are the key takeaways for Western governments and businesses as we, again, observe this conflict, knock on wood, from afar at the moment?
Yeah, it doesn't feel so far here, I must admit.
Yeah.
It's on the edge of Europe. It is very weird for all of us who've not had a conflict of that lifetime. But I would say two things really. One is preparation. So a number of people, Dimitri, David Petraeus mentioned Shields Up, and the NCSC, as you mentioned, has done something similar, and the great coordination actually between governments on this. And it shows that if you prepare and actually do the basics right, you can prevent a lot of attacks. And one of the reasons why Russia hasn't been maybe as active outside Ukraine as we expected, is the baseline of defences has got better. Now, it's a long way from perfect, we know that, but I think the advisories put out by CISA and others have been really excellent and reminding people of that list of vulnerabilities. Really good. And a lot of companies have taken that very seriously. Certainly ones I work with, I noticed they've really taken it seriously, and that's great. Second big takeaway for me, though, is supply chain, because Russia has specialized in embedding itself deep in the infrastructure and in supply chains. Remember the NotPetya attack. I mean, that was classic. Get inside a small accountancy firm software and you can affect half the world. SolarWinds, you know, they're very good at this. It's long-term thinking. And we have to assume there are other SolarWinds out there, that they're inside the infrastructure of a lot of companies, and at some stage might choose to activate that. So the takeaway for governments and businesses is, as well as shields up for your own company, you have to worry about your supply chain and your ecosystem. And if you're a big financial institution, you're going to have, I don't know, 10,000 plus vendors. Each of those represents some threat to you, some risk to you. It's hard to quantify what that risk is. And the risk may not come from the top tier. It's not going to come from your 4 or 5 biggest suppliers like Google or Microsoft or whoever. It may well, because you're good at security, you spend a lot of money on it. It's more likely to come from somewhere down the tail, you know, some company you've never heard of that is either connected to you or has sensitive data and is compromised because it has weak security. So I think the takeaway is, as well as your own shields up, you have to start worrying about the ecosystem around you and get the shields up for them. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I got involved in supply chain security many years ago now, and you're starting with the Kaspersky directives, and we really started taking action. And I learned a great deal. And one of those is it can be a very daunting, potentially overwhelming challenge for organizations as they, with great intent, say, okay, I'm going to get a handle on the security and resilience of my supply chain. But what should they be doing specifically, and how do we help them prioritize which actions to take?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is daunting because it's all, the volume of suppliers is huge. Trying to get a handle on the risk is a huge challenge, and it's dynamic and changing. So in the past, what companies have done is, at the point of onboarding, they've sent a questionnaire, which is, you know, self-marking, it's point in time, and it doesn't reflect that cyber threats are very dynamic. Our networks are changing, the attackers are changing, the attackers are scanning all the time to look for that open port that may be open for a short time, but long enough to be compromised. So I would say, and I've seen some advisories actually recently from NCSC and from CISA on this, on supply chain security. You've got to have an approach which is a bit like you would look at your own internal networks. How can you monitor your vendors continuously with external data, and look for the things that are very often obvious. So it's mostly about IT hygiene, and I spend a lot of time doing this for organizations, and it is striking that so many of these attacks are getting in through vulnerabilities which we've known about for years. They're getting in through failure to patch and upgrade, running old browsers. They're getting in through open ports, through poor configuration, through failure to use remote protocols properly, basically. All that is really easy to spot, actually, from the outside if you've got the right data and the right analytics. And we just have to start approaching our supply chains as we would our own internal networks, and starting worrying about them in real time. And then, I guess, crucially, my maybe final point is to go and do something about it, because it's all very well to admire the risk and quantify it and say, but how can you actually reduce it? And so going to a vendor and saying, please do something about this browser, or please close these ports and here's how you do it, or here's the patch for X and this is how to apply it. Because a lot of these vendors and small companies in small government organizations, they may have one IT person, yeah, and doing cybersecurity and everything, or they may have outsourced it. So there's a huge skills shortage, which I know Google and others are doing a lot to address, but we're never going to completely address it. So the answer has got to be trying to automate this visibility from the outside. And that's my view and where I spend most of my time.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I would add one additional piece would be more transparency by companies who are providing those software. And I think we're trying to do some. I know other companies are as well, but I think that's also important. So kind of related to that, from your time in government and now in the private sector, do you think that the governments in general, or if you want to talk to UK specifically, are doing enough on supply chain security, whether that's sharing threat information or promoting best practices or holding organizations accountable? Do you think more should be done there?
Well, by the way, I think you're doing great things on improving software development security. I mean, that's kind of a holy grail, but Google has the volume and the power to do that. And
yes.
You others are really making a difference there, and it'll take time, but it's going to be a game changer over time. But on your question, I think everybody's got the message now. So I've seen a lot of stuff coming from our government and from CISA about supply chain. I know the DoD is very focused on supply chain for obvious reasons, in every sense, not just cyber, but or company ownership and all the rest. It's a massive challenge. I think regulation is coming, certainly in the UK and Europe. I guess, I don't know, in the United States, but it's already pretty much there in the defense sector because of the risks. So everybody I meet from DoD is very, very focused on supply chain. So kind of a half answer to your question is I think everybody's got the message. The solutions are not easy. And as you say, the scale is huge and people can get overawed by it, but we have to start somewhere.
Absolutely. So coming back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we touched on this a little bit with the crowdsourcing of offensive cyber operations, how that could be a pivotal change. Do you have a sense of, just kind of putting your fortune teller hat on, how do you think this conflict might shape how we think about cybersecurity, cyber operations, cyber conflict in the future?
Well, I hope it will really help to underline the shields up message, if you like, get the basics right. Even the list of vulnerabilities that Dimitri mentioned earlier that CISA published, really helpful. You look down them, a lot of them are very old. So in other words, there's stuff we haven't been doing over the years. So I hope it will remind people that there's a real threat out there. It has a direct impact on businesses and governments. And let's at least get off the baseline in some companies that haven't even started yet. So that would be one really good takeaway. I think the future of conflict, though, it's going to remind everybody that what's possible through offensive cyber and through information operations, and that could lead to some sort of arms race. I mean, we're already seeing the spread of offensive cyber weapons across the world, and I saw the Belfer Center at Harvard's Cyber Power Index. You've got a lot of small countries now experimenting with this, so there's a kind of a free-for-all, which is not healthy. But it does mean that the big countries and that those who are defending democracy are going to need to have those capabilities and develop them. But above all, it means the rest of us need to get really good at defense. And as Leslie mentioned, assume that we're not always going to be successful. Of course, we need a response strategy and a resilience strategy too, but we could reduce the risk by, I guess, 80% by doing the shields up properly and by doing our supply chain. So I think the conflict is changing, and it's really unpredictable. The crowdsourcing of cyber attacks is a new thing, and we don't really know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
With a lot of talk here in Europe about will Putin use tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons? Will he use an attempt a catastrophic cyber attack? Any of those things I think become possible if he's backed into a corner.
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately. So let me check with Matt, who I see just popped up, and see if we have any questions from the audience.
We do. So Robert, one of the questions we've got is how do we look to the companies that are putting out our supply chain participants who are releasing vulnerability-laden releases. So the people who are putting out software that they know that's got a vulnerability in it, is there some level of accountability we should be moving in that direction with?
Yeah, so I think everybody is moving in that direction. Certainly, the European Union's put out something which is going to try to increase liability, legal liability for software security. I know in the Solarium Commission report that Chris Inglis, of course, had a huge hand in before he was in government, recommended something similar. And I think we have to move in that direction. It's going to be complex because who judges what is a reasonable risk in a new piece of software or a new operating system, something very complex. There's always going to have some flaws and vulnerabilities which need discovering. You're never going to get perfection. Who judges whether that's normal or negligent? And that's going to be a tough call. So there could be a bonanza for lawyers here trying to work out what is negligent. But we do certainly have to make companies more responsible. I think Jeanette touched on the work that Google and others are doing. But I think above all, we have to improve the culture in those doing the development. Out in the kind of non-technical world, everybody assumes that a high-tech company, a software development company, must be good at security. It doesn't follow at all. Yeah, as we know, everybody in this day knows that just doesn't follow. They may be brilliant at software development, but not even thought about security. And so we need to change that culture. We need to get people better at it. Yes, we need to test. The UK government's talking about some testing centres, vetting companies, not in a security sense, but in a quality control sense, giving them kind of kite marks. I'm not sure they'll go down that route, but a number of countries have. Singapore has, for example. Yeah, so you're dead right, Matt. I think everybody is looking at this area. How do we improve the quality of software? And also, what do we do about open source software? As we've seen some massive compromises through that way. I mean, more and more software is being developed from libraries that really nobody quite knows the origin of. So what can we do about open sourcing without closing everything down? Because as always with regulation, the downside is you stifle innovation, you stifle the small guys who can't afford to spend a lot of money on security. Those startups, the big companies will always manage it. So it's a delicate balance, I think, but we haven't got the balance right yet.
All right, and I saw Jeanette nodding along. I know that security by design is a phrase that it resonates well with all of us over here. One of the questions that came in from Patrick Gall was, for companies that are smaller, when we start talking about supply chain and how it dives in, how would you recommend they prioritize trying to get their budgets to point down this avenue? We heard a lot about open source being a good key here. Are you seeing that there's good open source data to kind of predict where some of these challenges are going to come from?
I think if you're really a small business or medium to small business, the best option is some kind of managed service. And increasingly, the big cloud providers, so Google, Microsoft, Amazon, are providing fantastic security products. And you are not, as a small business, going to be able to rival those. And the best option is to use them and use them well. And that will be both cost effective and optimizing your spend, but it will also give you better protection than you can buy yourself. I mean, we've seen over the last 10 years so many companies struggling to buy lots of products, plugging them all in together and not really sure what they're doing with this kind of slightly random stack. So I see the whole industry beginning to kind of coalesce around big cloud providers, especially as more and more businesses move to public cloud. Not for everything and not for all parts of government, but even government is, of course, using cloud now. So the honest answer, I think, for a small business is look at the basics, the brilliant guidance from CISA and NCSC. There's stuff you can do that doesn't cost much, actually. You can do yourself. And then think about a managed service through the cloud, because that's probably your best option.
Well, that is great, and thank you for that. Right now, I want to thank both of you. This has been a great conversation.